Welcome, everyone, to our next episode of Cor Ecclesiae. We're gathered here just practically on the eve of Christmas to talk about issues of compelling concern to the Roman Catholic Church and indeed to our sister churches and other religious denominations and faiths that have an interest in Catholicism and particularly an interest in the direction of the papacy of the first American Pope, Leo. Now, we're going to start off a little differently this time, but just having a kind of a lightning round in which each one of the panelists, including myself, will talk for 1 minute only about what they've been thinking about recently that might not be covered in the general conversation on our forum. So I can start with, and I will start with Charlie, because in great measure, this is Charlie's idea. So let's go, Charlie.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about Pope Leo's recent travels and how it's looking forward to some major milestones in the life of the church. We had a gathering of ecumenical leaders from across both the Roman Catholic and Orthodox world to celebrate 1700 years of the Council of Nicaea, and comments about a gathering of all of the world's Christian leaders in Jerusalem in 2033 to celebrate the 2000th anniversary of the resurrection of Christ. This is a really exciting time for interreligious, ecumenical, and unity questions and conversations in the church.
Oh, splendid. 2033 seems a while off, but perhaps, just perhaps, there'll be peace in the Holy Land at that time to accommodate all these leaders. Okay, Michelle, what do you think?
So, Charlie, that was a wonderful and lovely opening. I've been riffing on the summary report from the study commission on the female diaconate, the Petrarchy Commission. So a whole lot has been written about the opaque and mysterious and non-synodal and non-transparent process of that study group from its inception to its recent report. But the two things I want to quickly look at: one, the theological anthropology. So the report concludes that the masculinity of Christ is integral, not accidental, to the sacramental identity, and therefore, of course, women cannot be deacons. And I love the massacring of the metaphor of the next conclusion, that the masculinity of Christ is intrinsic to him as bridegroom to the church, and therefore, if women were deacons, we would have, wait for it, theological transgenderism confusion. So that's one piece that I like to offer for our reflection. There's another, and it's about holy orders. So there, as we know, there are 3 degrees of holy orders. It's one sacrament. It's deacon, priest, bishop. And the deacon actually doesn't celebrate mass, etc., doesn't hear confessions, but serves and can preach. But the issue, I think, the sticky issue, is with the permanent diaconate, right? So, which was restored by Lumen Gentium, the Second Vatican Council. And so it means that a man can choose to stay as a deacon. Now, if the church were to think of the permanent diaconate ad sacerdotum, right, to the priesthood, that would eliminate women as a possibility for the deacon. If it were to think of it as ad ministerium in the manner of service, then perhaps, if we think about Cardinal Newman's essaying the development of doctrine, then we could have the diaconate would have a sacramental distinctive type. And so that would perhaps allow the possibility for women as deacons in the church. But the church has to,
Michelle, you really
the church has to think this through.
minute, much more than 1 minute. Can we go to Dan now, please?
Sure. So I'm coming to you from New York, where it appears we are on the eve, perhaps literally, of having a new archbishop appointed. So a couple of days ago, a Spanish language outfit out of Madrid broke this news. Initially, it seemed like a lot of journalists were shying away from it. And then yesterday, the avalanche kind of came with multiple sources from multiple ideological persuasions, verifying that, in fact, this was about to happen, and that Ronald Hicks, who is currently the Bishop of Joliet, Illinois, is about to be named Archbishop of New York. There will be a lot to say about this. My initial reaction to this is it echoes John Paul II's appointment of John Cardinal O'Connor to New York, where he famously said, "I want a man like me in New York." It's hard to imagine in some ways, except for the fact that he is a diocesan priest and not a religious, a man more like Leo, somebody who is from Chicago, or he's a Cubs fan, and who spent 4 years in El Salvador. His Episcopal motto is in Spanish. So again, there will be a lot to say both about Bishop, soon to be Archbishop Hicks, and his outgoing predecessor, Cardinal Dolan, but a really fascinating move at a fascinating time for the church here in New York and in the United States.
Very good. I think we'll be coming back to that issue. When will Hicks actually take up his appointment? Do you know that?
Well, the rumor is that the announcement will be tomorrow. I would expect the installation to be sometime next month. An important sub-issue to this is that Christophe Cardinal Pierre turns 80 on January 30th. And I suspect that the timing of this has a lot to do with that.
I suspect that that's right. We'll come back to this because leadership in the church matters. And so the names that come forward, as we discussed in the previous one when we had our guest, Michael Sean Winters, present, talking about who's going to be the leader of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops and who's going to be the vice president. So it really matters on the ground. My brief reflection is about the celebritization of the papacy. I have divided feelings about it. Turning the Pope into a celebrity is a difficult issue, I think. It really began in earnest with John Paul II. And Francis, of course, fought it, but at the same time was a victim of it. What do you do with it? I mean, so the Vatican makes a big thing about Michael Bublé singing in the Holy See over the concert for the poor, the lunch for the poor and whatnot. This is all to the good. But in a way, it's a temptation I think we need to resist. Turning the Pope into a celebrity figure, which is a uniquely, I think, U.S. compulsion, is problematic because you end up in a realm of papalatry. The Pope becomes an object of entertainment and interest and celebrity. He's Peter. He's the Bishop of Rome. And Francis went further than any pope since John the 23rd to humanize the face of that papacy. It seems to me to celebritize it is to do what happened in the U.S. when you began the celebritization of your president, which really began in earnest with Bill Clinton. There's a downside to this. I don't want to be cynical or negative about this because Francis, too, took part in this. He brought humorists and comedians from all over the world, lectured to them, and had them entertain him. So it's a complex thing. It's not easy to solve, but it seems to me that the tendency to celebritize the papacy has its downside. Anyway, before we begin, and I think maybe because Michelle has alighted on an issue that is driving a lot of energy and reaction in the United States and indeed across the world, and that is the Pataki Commission. Maybe we should start talking about that before we shift into conversation about synodality, because what happened with the Pataki Commission is in some ways anti-synodal. So we need to talk about synodality and the synod and Leo's commitment to it and the commitment of the lesser clergy to it, which seems to be the higher point. So we'll come back to that. But just to remind our audience here that Michelle Loris is the Assistant Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. She's a writer and just recently finished a graduate degree in theology. So congratulations, Michelle. Charlie Gillespie is also an assistant dean in performing arts and also just finished a book that's being widely circulated on spectacle and theology and Broadway and Revelation and all kinds of related things. So congratulations, Charlie. And Dan, who is our regular contributor to Commonweal, bringing his not only theological acuity, but also his journalistic finesse to an area and a magazine of note. And he's also in charge of the Catholic Studies Department at Sacred Heart University. I'm Michael Higgins. I'm a distinguished professor emeritus of a couple of universities, including Sacred Heart University, which is close to my own heart. And I have a book on synodality that's just been published and will be out in January called A Journey Diary, Synod Diary, 60 Days That Shook the Church. Well, it's not been quite an earthquake. It's been more like a very mild tremor. But anyway, anything that can shake up our own beloved church in 60 days is worth looking at closely. So welcome, everyone. Going back now to the Patriarchy Commission. Michelle, I interrupted you when you were getting to your third point because we were moving along there on that 1 minute constraint. Do you want to come back to that and tell us what you think, and then we'll open it up to the other panelists?
Well, I think that is a key issue that the church, the magisterium, has never really ruled on the female diaconate, but it has to determine really whether or not the permanent diaconate, I think, would go towards the priesthood or towards service. And if it did go towards service, then this is just thinking, and I think the two theologians here might want to comment on that, but using Newman's essaying on the development of doctrine, not the rupture of doctrine, then the diaconate could be thought of as sacramental distinct type. That would allow a space for women to be considered for the diaconate. Now, there are other considerations for sure, but I'll just add to that the fact of the sacred human dignity created in the image of God, the baptismal dignity. These are things that I think are also in that consideration. But that was what struck me the most. I mean, there's a lot to say about that Patriarchy Commission, and its anti-synodal way of evolving, non-transparent, I mean, really very mysterious and secretive at times. I mean, the names of the members were never published. But in any case, I'd like to hear if Dan or Charlie might want to comment on the holy orders.
Comment. That's why they're here. Charlie, what do you think?
I think Michelle's opened up the questions of the Patriarchy Commission really well for us, because one of the responses that a number of commentators have made is that it's surfacing the fact that there is not consensus in the global church around how we understand the sacrament of holy orders, particularly as it regards the diaconate. Right? Michelle gave us the fine theological distinction between ad sacerdotem. So is the diaconate on the way to priesthood? So you almost get an evolution account of holy orders, that it finds its fullness in the episcopacy? Or is it something about ministry to the church, ad ministerium, a sense of the fact that holy orders may also possibly be related to other ministries of the church that aren't the same as the sacerdotal priesthood? This is a really profound theological question that the whole world is grappling with right now. The only comment I want to add is that the status of the diaconate has, to use another phrase we talk about, the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful. The permanent diaconate has not been received with gusto for the whole global church. And I do think it's an important reminder for those of us in contexts where the permanent diaconate after Vatican II did take off, like in the United States, to recognize that this question may be at different places around the world. So I want to talk more about whether transparency and synodality are necessarily the same thing. Because one of the things we're seeing here is actually, how do we move in a synodal way when even opening the question demonstrates a way in which church unity is at some of its most fractious? What do we do about a theological point that's not the same around the whole world? Dan, what do you think about all this?
So I think there's a couple of things going on here. One of them, so this whole process, right, which was one of several commissions on the female diaconate that was commissioned by Pope Francis, is one of the ways in which the kind of process of synodality that Francis started in other areas was diverged from some of the ways that he kind of ran things close to himself, and on issues like this that he kind of reserved um, for whatever reason. And it's an issue that I think he himself was somewhat uncomfortable with, despite having some pastoral understanding that people were asking for it and wanting to do something about it. I think so. Phil Zagano, right, who's the kind of foremost English language commentator on this issue, right, keeps saying about this matter, right, that they can't say no, but they won't say yes, right, as essentially where this issue has been stuck. And that's where, again, the commission trying to bring in language that's been used in debates about women's ordination to the priesthood is in fact distracting from the more kind of precise theological and historical issue here, in order to justify a conclusion that makes sense if that's what you're worried about. What I would say is I think there is a larger set of questions here. I agree with Charlie. There is a global question here about comfort level, both with women in ministry and with the question of the permanent diaconate, that I think there is a need to speak to on some level, right, to avoid schism, to avoid some of the issues the Anglican communion has had on these precise kinds of matters. On the other hand, right, I'm actually concerned about a version of the female diaconate that is so sequestered from the question of women's ordination to the priesthood that it in fact doubles down on some of that kind of language. So the persistence of some of that kind of language tells me there is a need to open a broader synodal process here. And some of the things that Pope Leo has said about development of doctrine on a broader level lead me to think that that may happen, though I wouldn't expect it to happen in like 6 months.
No, and I'm glad you mentioned that, and Michelle mentioned it as well in terms of Newman and the development of doctrine. Of course, he made him a doctor of the church, and it does seem to me a serious reflection on Newman does involve some serious reflection on aspects of Newman's thinking that it makes us uncomfortable. One of the things about the debate around the Patriarchy Commission that struck me, because this has been around for a while, right? When Inter Insignares appeared in 1976-77, which was Paul VI's response to the question as it had arisen. It was very clear from the Pontifical Biblical Commission that the argument couldn't be made on biblical grounds alone, or indeed primarily. And the Pope didn't. And so if you go back and read Inter Insignares, you'll find a careful argument that I find ultimately unpersuasive, that is really historical, cultural, and canonical, rather than any serious way theological. This is where it seems to me that Cardinal Petrarchi is right, that this is in fact a doctrinal issue. And so he pushes it back up. It's a way of avoiding that the commission having to make a decision which is divisive and fractious for sure, but it puts it back in the papal court. So what it's going to involve, it seems to me, is a serious rethinking of our philosophical anthropology, because if we keep going back to the argument which was made presumably by a minority of the commission, and Charlie's right to talk about its division, the argument around the masculinity of Jesus is problematic. And it's also a distraction, to use Dan's phrase, because in a real sense, the church has, particularly in its leadership, has tried to avoid the excesses of biblical literalism. So the argument on a masculine basis seems to me counterproductive, but it's been there from the outset, folks. This is not new. I can remember in the 1970s when we put together our handbook, Women in the Church, these questions around, okay, if you allow young girls to be altar girls, They're not going to be satisfied with this. The next thing you know, they're going to want to be presbyters. And the next thing after that, they're going to want to be episcopate. This was the argument from the beginning. When pastors would say, we don't really need young girls in they make the altar boys jealous. They won't behave appropriately because they'll be distracted hormonally by the presence of young girls. Craziness, craziness. So we had all this. And this is a version of it, actually, a more sophisticated version of it. You let the women in, and there is concern. It comes up in the commission. You let the women in, and then they're going to start thinking, why am I a deacon, but I'm a second-class deacon? I'm not on equivalent level. I'm a new kind of deacon, and I'm a new kind of deacon that can't enter the presbyterate. So yes, it's murky waters. Yes, we need to think about this. Yes, it's doctrinal. I have no sense, however, that the church authorities are taking this with the gravity that they should. I think they're trying to minimize it, frankly. Anyway, that raises the issue of synodality. Michelle and the rest of you have always also said this is a if not anti-synodal way of working, right? Keeping the names from, not really being forthright. Why are they doing this? Because they're frightened. This is what happened with the Minority Commission at the time of Humanae Vitae in 1968. The Majority Commission was very clear where it stood. Paul was Hamlet-like and sometimes indecisive and fearful. The Minority Commission appealed to his fear. And we know how that ended. So is this a repeat of that? Now, let's go to the theologians first. Well, you're all theologians now. Dan, Charlie, and Michelle, what's your response to this?
So, as I had commented, right, I think this commission is in some ways one of the echoes of the way Pope Francis approached this issue, right? This was already heading toward this conclusion when Leo was elected, and so it concluded and came out with its report. I think it remains to be seen how a new pope is going to take up these kinds of matters, except to say, right, I think a couple of things we've seen with Leo is he was elected because he is an effective manager who is good at communicating within the organization. Secondly, I think there is, frankly, a cohort replacement issue here in terms of turning over the institution generationally with people who are more comfortable working with women, working alongside women who are doing more than kind of service jobs. And I suspect that will make a cultural difference as far as the kinds of conversations that are being had on these issues. But I think all the other issues we floated are still there, notwithstanding all that. But I do think that kind of cohort replacement issue is an underrated one here.
Okay, Charlie.
So Michael invited me to imagine Pope Leo as Hamlet-like, and I'm going to take advantage of this invitation, which is Hamlet also has another strategy in addition to his hesitation, which is to put things out there and see how people react. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. I do think that Pope Leo has moved Pope Francis's strategy on the question of the female diaconate by pressing for the release of this report. So while there is secrecy about process, and I think Michael, as always, is quite sage to hear echoes of Humanae Vitae in how we're grappling with this question, there is a key difference, which is it is now in a synodal church and open for our very discussion around how important this question is. The report did not include any phraseology that said this question is closed. It did not suggest that the problem is solved, and it's actually called the whole of the church to a more fundamental doctrinal question. Now, for the theology wonks, that's really exciting. We actually get to grapple with sacramental theology for the church in the modern world. That's really thrilling for me. But I think it's also calling everyone around this question, to Michael's point about the danger of letting women too close to the altar. It may in fact be that the gatekeeping here is to resist another ancient motto for how we think about development of doctrine, which is lex orandi, lex credendi. What the church wants to pray should become the law of belief, but this might take time. So my last point on this as a theologian is that I think Pope Leo has created structures where it's not going to be hidden in the basement of a synodal process, but recognize that this one needs some teaching from the church prior to when we can do the work of synodality. And while that might feel anti-synodal, I actually want to rather boldly suggest this is supporting synodality on this question, because like I said a little earlier, it's going to require those of us who have a comfort with the permanent diaconate to sit and listen to the concerns of parts of the world that did not receive this teaching from Vatican II with gusto. And I think that's a chastening of sometimes our sense of superiority in the North Atlantic, that we have received the council the right way and our brothers and sisters in the rest of the world did not. And I think that that's an important thing for us to have to sit and grapple with, even while we loudly and correctly press for a recognition that women were serving as deacons for the whole history of the church. This is not an open question. What is an open question is the doctrinal issue.
Yes, I think so. Before we get to Michelle, just 2 points, Charlie. I think I mentioned it was Pope Paul who was Hamlet-like, not Leo. Okay, if I missed Steve, it was Paul I was thinking of Hamlet-like, not Leo.
That is fair. I was taking the invitation of a comparison to Paul to talk about Pope Leo as the other kind of Hamlet. That's all. If you'd like to hear more about thoughts on Broadway, you can say
I love Hamlet. I do think there is a potential to be Hamlet-like in Leo, but it was Paul that I was thinking about. The other thing is, just to speak personally for a second about the permanent diaconate. I've been involved for quite a number of years in giving retreats to permanent deacons and their wives in Spokane and Albany, Buffalo, Rochester, Ottawa, Kingston, all kinds of different places, and basically on the spirituality of Henry Nouwen's spirituality of the wounded, because as we continue to say, and as Michelle indicated from the beginning, we're talking about the diaconate, we are talking about service, right? That's what the term diaconia means. At the end, when they're doing a kind of a summary, in every instance, the deacons would say, actually, it's our wives who should be the deacons. They're the ones doing the work. And I always, and this was conservative deacons as well. And I always found that quite interesting, because here on the ground with deacons doing their ministry and with the mentally challenged or the homeless or whatever, in the end came back and said, really, it's our wives who live the ministry of the deacon. So that's something at that lived area, it seems to be important. And that's where synodality shines. When people gather around the table and they hear these things, they learn about aspects of the global church they didn't know before. And that makes us more sensitive and open to the evolution of doctrine. Because I think Charlie's quite right on this. We're talking a long gestation. This is how it works in our church, right? So there's not Leo's not going to come out tomorrow and say, "Oh, well, I've made the decision, contrary to the commission and everything else. I'm going to move on the ordination of women to the diaconate as we understand it, not an iteration or variation of it, but as it is." That isn't really going to happen. What is going to happen, it seems to me, is an invitation to deeper thinking about this, strengthening the synodal model so people hear what it is, what is the primary issue facing the African church, and then you discover it's polygamy. Well, North Americans don't think of it in those terms, right? But it's an openness, a willingness to bring people into conversation about cultural realities that have an impact on the way they live, the way they pray, and what they believe. They hold, yes, as Charlie said, the lex credendi, lex orandi. Okay, before we get on to synodality, because it does seem to me this is linked. Michelle, could you want to step in here?
I think maybe I'll be able to begin our conversation about synodality, but let me just begin with, you do have to watch the women.
Yeah.
Here I am among these 3 men, right?
Yes.
Have to be careful, right? We do have some history, right? Wasn't Phoebe a deacon of the church, although it wasn't clear whether it had the sacramental character? But nonetheless, here's what Leo says. Leo, in his interview with Crux, he said he wasn't inclined right now to change the church's teaching on he has to deal with doctrine. That's the central issue. That's why I brought up the whole question of holy orders, because the issue the church has to deal with is doctrine. He wasn't inclined to do that, but he was open to listening. And every time he describes what being synodal is like, he says it has an attitude of openness, listening to the other, walking together, listening to the other with understanding. Those are all his descriptions, all his words. He also addressed the fact that when we face people who are resistant or who are afraid, the important thing is he thinks formation pathways are a way to responding to resistance and fear, meaning what you were talking about before, which is having people together who don't agree, who culturally have different attitudes, but having them listen to the gospel, reflect on the gospel, and speak to each other, listen to each other, and walk together. Every time he has described synodality, that's the way he's described it. And if the church, even at its glacier-like speed, will move towards thinking about this doctrinal development, because it can't be a doctrinal change, right? But as it would, in the magisterium, as I said before, has never ruled on the female diaconate. So I think you're right, Charlie, that he published this report, I think does speak to his desire to begin small seeds of embryonic conversations, synodal conversations about it. He's a strategic thinker. He's a canonical thinker. He's methodological in the way he approaches things. So I don't think it'll be ever soon, but I think he means to bring this for the church's consideration, reflection, conversation in a synodal way. And that will work slowly. But everything he says about synodality really, how to address the fear, how to listen to each other. He said to create change in terms of the female diaconate, he said you have to begin with changing cultural attitudes. That will only happen in a synodal conversation.
Yes.
And so I think there'll be more for us to see, and perhaps this can begin our conversation on synodality.
Yes, but I also think, the release of the Pataki Commission document, and I'm talking about this in political strategic terms, perhaps a little more cynically than you are, Michelle, isn't just an opening of an invitation. It's a way of shortchanging or delimiting the impact when decisions have to be made concerning the 10 study group reports. So if you know an issue is going to be particularly explosive, and if you think it's going to actually distract from the larger conversation about synodality, you're going to want to get out into the open and get this done first. So it seems to me that this is a calculated leak, if you like. It's a way of saying, okay, this is what the commission has recommended. We don't make the decision, has recommended. And issues around the process of that, the nature of the two commissions, it's being in part suborned by the Congregation for the Doctrine, or the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. What's Cardinal Fernandez going to say now? It's a way, actually, I think, of controlling the agenda and not losing sight of the deeper issue of synodality, having this brought forward. And of course, that's exactly what it's doing. It's generating all the kind of conversation all of us are reacting to, that's going on all over the place. And I think in the end, that's probably to the good. But I do see it perhaps a little more cynically as a move to deflect attention before we get to the release of the study documents, which we're supposed to have at the end of this month, actually. But here's something. Father Orabator, who is the Dean of Theology at Santa Clara University, known theologian, he wrote an article for America Magazine not long ago in which he took on Cardinal Müller of Germany and said that synodality is not a Trojan horse. Many, of course, think that synodality is, in fact, a Trojan horse, that you're going to have it in the church governance structure. Next thing you know, up will pop the Trojans, or the Greeks, rather, and the next thing you know, you've blown up the whole operation from the inside. Orabator, I think, makes a compelling argument that that's in fact not the case, and I think most of the synod delegates certainly don't subscribe to that view. But Cardinal Müller does represent a position, I think, that has some currency in the church. Maybe he phrases it a little more dramatically, but for many people, of the clergy in particular, it's a fear of a loss of identity, their sacramental ministry, their responsibility for authority, magisterial or otherwise. So I don't know if you had the chance to read Orabator's article or whatnot, but if there is a fear out there that synodality is a Trojan horse, how do you think we should address it? Dan, we'll go to you first.
Sure. So, I mean, this language has history. So, the German Catholic philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand, who later in his life took a kind of conservative turn, wrote a book called Trojan Horse in the City of God, which is really about the implementation of Vatican II. And so it's no surprise that Mueller, a conservative German, would pick up on that language. I would say, right, a lot of the arguments we're having here are really trying to grapple with the way that Pope Francis has taken the pressure off of some of these conversations that was applied by Paul VI at the end of Vatican II with two decisions, right? One was about the Synod of Bishops, and the other was the one that you described about Humani Vitae, right? Those two decisions set the course for the next almost 50 years of church history, right? And it was very clear when Pope Francis was elected and with some of the decisions that he made that he wanted to revisit those, but not in a deliberate way, not in a way of saying, I'm going to go back and undo what my predecessor did, but trying to create an open space for conversation, right? Dialing back on investigations of theologians, right? And starting the synodal process. Obviously, people like Cardinal Mueller, who were invested in that, right? Obviously, he was prefect when Francis became pope, right? And they had notable disagreements on various issues, which have led him to where he is now. But also many people who were enculturated into the church, particularly during the papacy of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, right, are very uncomfortable with having open conversations where they can't immediately advert to, but church authority says we can't really discuss it in this way. We need to just listen to what the Pope, meaning JP2 or Benedict XVI, said about this matter, right? There's a lot of discomfort there. But again, I think we're trying to really implement this aspect of Vatican II that was, again, for various reasons, cut off by Paul in its infancy. And again, this kind of goes back to my comments about the diaconate conversation too, right? Is I think there's a broader conversation to be had on all of these things, because that pressure runs through Inter Insignores and Ordinatio Sacerdotales too. And so I don't want to just take those things for granted. And I think all of that is tied into why people like Mueller are so uncomfortable.
Yeah, good. Hey, Charlie.
Well, I think if we're thinking about Trojan horses, we have to recognize that from the ashes of Ilium, Rome is born. So I do think the concern about synodality being something that's so profoundly disruptive to the church as we have inherited it is a valid concern for people who think that the mission of the church is to maintain Christendom in a particular historical moment. The middle point, though, that I'll get to last, which is I also think that there tends to be a valorization of synodality, where we want it to be a Trojan horse. So if Muller's right that there is this community that's concerned that synodality is going to sneak in through the walls and undermine this beautiful city that the church has built, and Dan's laid that out for us really well. There also tends to be a sense that synodality is going to be the second coming of Christ, and synodality is the Messiah the church has been waiting for, that's going to get us to suddenly do everything together. And I think the right answer echoes something that some of the cardinals we've had at Sacred Heart University have pointed out in our series of talks about synodality, which is the church, despite our desire for it to be democratic, is not a democracy. Synodality always exists in dialectical tension with the hierarchical structure of a global church community and the successor of Peter in the Holy Roman Pontiff. So I do think that what the church needs to embrace is that synodality is a style and not a governance structure. And so my response to Cardinal Mueller's concern about the Trojan horse is to say, it's only a Trojan horse if you want to keep living in Troy, Cardinal Mueller. This is the call to go forth and build the city of God in the third millennium.
Good point. Always wise to bring a classical allusion into into this, Michelle.
So I think Leo, is well aware of the kind of fear that's behind this. And you hear this in, for example, his homily at the Jubilee Mass. And he talks about the resistance and the fear, and he talks about trying to not, that the church should not be like the Pharisee, should not be relying on ego and power, but rather that love is the rule of the church, right? And so one of the things he tells us about synodality is that the main purpose of synodality is simply to foster the church's mission as a missionary church proclaiming the gospel. So he's trying to alleviate some of the fear, the anxiety that the people, talking about the Trojan horse have. Their fear is that they're going to lose power. Their fear is that they're going to lose their place. Their fear is that they won't have the authority. And everything that, when Leo talks about synodality, I think all the things that he is saying is trying to respond to some of that fear. He says, because fear is irrational. What is it? Comes out of the feeling that I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm afraid I'm going to be disrupted in some way, or hurt or harmed in some way. That's the basis of fear. And Leo, I think in all of his conversations about synodality is, to Charlie's point, it's never going to replace the hierarchy. There will always be a hierarchy, but what it will do is simply make the church more participative. And just bring people, the lay people, men and women together with the clerics to be able to talk more with each other. And that's all synodality intends. However, as I said to you before the program began, there is resistance to it. You see that there are bishops, at least in the United States, who are just stalled, not going to address synodality. This is the year from last June to December 2026. In that year, for that the Pathways document for implementation, phase 1 has asked the dioceses across the world to start the implementation in their ordinary ways of doing that. But in America, we're seeing that some of the bishops have not begun that work, that they're preoccupied with other things. This is an interesting.
That's a generous reading of it. I don't think it is preoccupied, but it's also avoidance. And It's not just the American hierarchy. There are several other English-speaking hierarchies in the same place. I just want to say, I think you capture very well, Michelle, what synodality is, but I wouldn't restrict it just simply to an attitude, an openness, a frankness, a participative thing. It does seem to me that it has embedded in it the real potential for reform. And that's where I think some of the conservatives are right. They see a danger that maybe the progressives or the optimists don't see by minimizing that. Because it does seem to me that when people do come together and they talk, just like at the Second Vatican Council, they come together, they talk, and they discover things they didn't know before. And this speaks again to the universal church that Charlie was talking about. And they learn things that they didn't know before. And then in the process of those conversations, reform begins to happen. So conciliarity, collegiality, these kinds of things coming from the Second Vatican Council. I think synodality is more than just an attitude. It's more than just an openness or disposition. It's also an invitation to do some serious rethinking. But that serious rethinking requires a lot of prep. And that lot of prep comes from the Paridi, from general consultation, to what you rightly say, Michelle, is the breakdown of a culture of fear. Because you don't hear things when you're fearful, right? It only reinforces what you say. Let me give you this interesting sentence or two from a British theologian who's a philosophical theologian by the name of Hal St. John Broadbent, and he's from London. And he writes the following, and I agree with him, and I want to hear your reaction. Synodality requires a kenotic emptying of clerical privilege and a fearless reimagining of authority, governance, and ministry. It means creating permanent, empowered spaces, not structures, for the sensus fidei of all the faithful, not as a courtesy, but as a constitutive element of church decision-making. Synodality is not about improving clergy-lay relations. It's about dismantling a pyramid of power. Now, that's kind of radical for some people, but I do recall Pope Francis again and again talking about the inverting of the pyramid as an ecclesial model. So, as we look at this, do you see synodality having the potential of being profoundly disruptive, or do you see it just as a pastoral palliative for an unquiet time? What do you think? Go back to Dan again, then Charlie, then Michelle.
Well, I think the whole idea of synodality, right, is it's what the church makes of it, right? That the whole idea of synodality is supposed to be having conversations and letting the conversations go where they go. So insofar as that's the case, yes, I think there is the potential to be profoundly disruptive, especially in places like the United States, right, where the church has had a kind of way of doing things that is falling apart, and that is being replaced on the ground domestically by profoundly non-synodal solutions, mostly funded by rich people. So and this is one of the reasons why people are afraid of synodality, including bishops and clerics, because they like that other kind of lay version of the church that's been growing, and they're uncomfortable with one that would empower people they've never been comfortable talking to. So I think it does have the potential to be profoundly disruptive, but I think it also is just the way of the church continuing to become itself, particularly as a global institution that it's become since Vatican II, right? And that's going to have continuities, but it's also going to have discontinuities. But again, the idea of synodality is that those are coming from the grassroots. Those are coming from those conversations. They're not coming from the Pope issuing a letter saying, well, you were used to doing things this way, but now we're doing things this way, right? That's much more jarring as a process of reform than the synodal process. But it's also, when it happens, it's also much more of a snap judgment, whereas the synodal process does reward patience.
Ah, good. Charlie.
So I think I want to echo something Michelle has said before in our conversation today and in many conversations in her work, which is when we think about synodality, it's about changing the culture of our abilities to listen and hear one another. And I think that cultural change will be one of the most disruptive and profound reforms in the history of the church, because we have seen that the assumptions of clericalism, which is not just about the clerics, it's also about the laity. The assumptions of clericalism cannot be legislated away. That must be a cultural change. And if we think about the image of the Synod Hall, where you had the world sitting together at tables, and we take that image of the spaces of synodality, which is what I loved from that quote you read, which is that we need to carve out physical spaces to be together, to participate in the kenosis of the triune God, the self-emptying that makes a space to let be freedom. That bravery to set down our titles, to not be associate dean, professor, and running things, but just a Charlie talking to friends about the importance of Christ's message as a part of the church, that reception of Vatican II, that image of co-responsibility as how the people of God act and walk together, that has the capacity to be profoundly disruptive, reformative, and transformational. But I don't know if we'll see that transformation for hundreds of years. But synodality as a reception of Vatican II could be as consequential for the history of the church as scholasticism in its reception of Trent.
Very good. Michelle.
So, I I do think synodality will be disruptive it's meant to be. In fact, the definition of synodality by the Synod on Synodality was that it is spiritual renewal and structural reform to bring about the church's goal as a missionary church, and that disruption will occur in the way that Charlie and Dan have been describing. If the sensum fidei is taking place, if people are listening to each other, if the church is listening to the thoughts of the laity, of men and women, and as well as to other clergy, if the church is thought of as the people of God, then those conversations are going to be disruptive. They're going to change. They're going to make structural changes. It will be a different way of being church. It will be a different way of being church. And you're right, Charlie. It will have to address clericalism. It will have to address the misogyny in the church. That will come slowly. That will come perhaps in a slow undercurrent stream. But those changes occur when people sit and speak to each other who have different points of view, who come from different cultures, and truly are open. This is what I meant about an open attitude, and are really listening to each other. That creates change. All right. All right. I see that in teaching in the CIT seminars. I see that, when we have our students who have different perspectives on things, but they're listening to each other. And over the course of the semester, they change, they grow, their attitudes are different. But it takes time. But this is a deep listening. This is not the kind of listening that we ordinarily do. I'm talking and you're thinking about in your mind, how you're going to respond or rebut to what I'm saying, rather than, and I'm just mean us as an example, rather than taking in what I'm saying, taking in who I am, why I'm afraid, what my cultural attitudes are, to really hear that. That's what synodality requires. It is a hard listening. It is very difficult.
Hard and deep listening. You're right about that. And you can see that at the press conferences in Rome when we met with the Synod delegates, and they talked about how that hard and deep learning was a complicated factor, but it was also a deeply enriching dimension, right? And that brings us to the final question we have to look at briefly in the time that's left to us, and that is, how are the bishops implementing this? Because you do know that when we're talking about synodality, and you're quite right, Michelle. I mean, I've seen it, I've been at it, I've covered it. It's a deep investment. It's not, let's have a little conversation after Mass and at coffee, right? It's a deep investment. So that means that the leadership has to take on a very proactive role in this. And as the Tablet of London has made clear, and certainly Austin Ivory has, that the Welsh and English and Scots bishops, well, Welsh and English certainly, are not responding to the degree one would expect. In Canada, it's surprising and depressing to see the lack of leadership on synodality as a priority. And we know what that experience has been in the US. So how then, if we're going to take this momentum of synodality, this new way of thinking deeply and listening collectively about a new ecclesiology that will take decades, if not centuries, to unfold in the Roman manner, how are we going to do this if the leadership is not going to begin the kind of serious implementing at the diocesan, local, parish, and university level? Universities are leading. My sense is, and Francis observed this in an earlier document, how important it is for the universities to take leadership in this. It's a recognition, I think, that this is going to be an obligation of the laity. It's not surprising to me entirely, although it is in one sense. We now talk about Newman. Newman was the figure who really was critical to the Second Vatican Council because of his influence on the new theology in Paris, because of the work that he did in patristics and everything else. And so now we talk about him as the spirit of the council, right? But he's also the spirit of synodality, because the concern now with sensus fidei, or the sensus fidelium, that entry into theological consciousness was largely the result of Newman's 1859 book on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine. So I'm delighted to see, thrilled to see that Leo has raised him to the status of a doctor of the church, but I still don't see our own theologians and the paridi and the learned experts actually making Newman critical to what we mean by synodality as it unfolds. Maybe that's also going to take time. How are we going to get our bishops to get excited about synodality and get it active in the parishes? How's that going to happen? Dan, a minute each for each, because we're about ready to wrap up here. So that's a tough question to ask at the last moment. But Dan, what do you think?
Sure. The bishops in the United States are going to have to embrace synodality because, frankly, I think they don't have a choice if they want the church to remain a vibrant and living community in the country. Around the country, we've seen parish mergers, shortage of priests, right? The model of church that bishops and lay people have been accustomed to is falling apart. And for the church to sustain itself, people need to see the church as a place that is more than just their local clergy, certainly if they even know who their local bishop is, right? But they need to see it as an institution that's responsive and that's interested in them. And that's going to be a synodal church. The bishops have been practicing a version of synodality, a parody of it with the Napa Institute and other well-funded lay initiatives. But I think they're going to need to embrace a more capacious one and listen to some people, women, theologians, other people that they may have not been accustomed to having much care for the opinions of in order for the institution to move forward.
Charlie?
So slightly different tack from Dan. I want to suggest that there's also going to be pressure from above. Pope Leo has called an extraordinary consistory of the cardinals of the world, and if the Bishop of Rome can have synodality for the global church with the Roman Curia from around the whole planet, then local diocesan bishops should be able to get a few people to drive a couple of miles to be in that kenotic space that we've been talking about. I think it's got to be pressure from the laity pointing out that that is the tone being set by the guy over the mountains.
Wow, good allusion. Yes, indeed. He is calling them together for this extraordinary consist.
Let's see what that may be our next conversation.
May well be. Okay, 1 minute, Michelle, for you to.
All right. Well, I think I think the universities need to initiate and maybe create some kinds of connections with their diocese. This is something that Massimo Fagioli has talked about a bit, there's been a separation of the universities often from the diocese. And so, to Charlie's point, it will take oftentimes the laity to initiate these conversations, to initiate the work. We'll see. I think it's open yet. It's open.
That's right. Yes. Thanks, all of you. We're wrapping up right now. This episode is called Synodality and Stuff. We certainly had a lot to talk about, both the stuff and synodality. We'll look forward to the consistory in January, and perhaps, depending upon when it happens and when we have our next podcast, that will be the primary subject of exploration for us. So thanks to our audience for watching us. Certainly tell your friends, let people know about Cor Ecclesiae. It's a major driver for informed reflection and commentary here in the United States and hopefully abroad. And we're on the eve of the Christmas season. Well, we're not on the eve. We're well into the holy season, but within only a week or so of Christmas itself. So we extend the peace of the new year to you, and the peace and joy brought by the Lord in the power of incarnation. And we'll see you in 2026.